The 90s teen pop and R&B scenes were filled with rivals. Britney Spears versus Christina Aguilera and Brandy versus Monica are some of the most notable. The Spice Girls are probably the only act from that era that didn't have a direct rival, being that they repopularized teen pop in the 90s, had a head start by a couple of years before the likes of Britney began to pop up, and were so massive. They coasted in their own lane and spawned many Spice-like groups that walked in their footsteps. Of course, the Spice Girls were compared to other girl groups, but they remained relatively unchallenged in the teen pop rival department. There was no Christina to their Britney. A lot of these comparisons and rivals were meticulously planned and promoted by labels to increase sales and publicity. And a lot of 90s teen pop stars' stardom seemed codependent on fabricated rivalries. Although the Spice Girls were a short-lived anomaly for girl groups, the boy groups that debuted around the same time as them did not have the same luck, and it was made pretty clear early on that they were meant to be direct rivals, although they were something of brother groups. They had obvious similarities but were packaged differently. And of course, those two boy groups are Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. A conversation that if sparked today could still cause as strong of a reaction as it did decades ago, especially for people who grew up in the era. Both groups stand as some of the most towering and defining acts of the 90s, permeating through pop culture in a way that is extremely rare to obtain. As opposed to some of the more surface level comparisons during that era, NSYNC and Backstreet Boys had more in common than just being two boy groups existing at the same time. They made similar music, had a similar setup, and both came from the mind of one person, Lou Pearlman. Lou was the mastermind behind the boy band craze of the 90s, and he had the heaviest hand in how the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC were formed, marketed, and subsequently pitted against each other. Lou Pearlman began leasing planes to pop acts. One of the acts he leased his plane to happened to be none other than 80s supergroup New Kids on the Block. Interested in how such young people were able to afford such luxuries, he realized the amount of money in the music business and turned to boy bands. The New Kids on the Block really set the stage for the 90s boy band, and the way they were packaged could be seen in a lot of acts after them. And Lou wanted his own version of them, which resulted in auditions for a boy group. Lou sought out to put together a group of charismatic young boys. Eventually, the selected members would form into the now iconic lineup consisting of AJ McLean, Kevin Richardson, Nick Carter, Howie D, and Brian Littrell. They clicked very well and by their own account sounded great together. They essentially knew they had something special the moment they all sang together. Lou put the boys together so they could bond. He put them in boot camp where they did vocal lessons, had tutors, and worked on choreography. Lou was initially a very endearing figure for all of them. He acted as a father figure and they all got along well. Lou had a lot of drive to make them a success, and he even invested what was believed to be his own money into them. The boys would rehearse 6 to 8 hours a day to master their craft. The Backstreet Boys had a very gradual rise that would eventually develop into meteoric superstar status. Little did they know, Lou was already secretly forming a second group to be their competitors, and of course that would become NSYNC. The Backstreet Boys' initial success was based throughout Europe. In 1997, they would rise to the international world stage with their self-titled album. The group did vigorous promotion for the album, appearing on several shows, and it paid off immensely. The album went on to sell over 14 million copies. The Backstreet Boys were pretty much unstoppable teen pop phenomenons, and NSYNC would follow them closely after. The original lineup consisted of Justin Timberlake, Jay-Z, Chris Kirkpatrick, Joey Fatone, and Jason Galasso. It wasn't until Jason dropped out that Lance Bass came in, and he fit perfectly within the dynamic. Chris Kirkpatrick actually helped recruit members for the group. The NSYNC boys had a lot of chemistry and initially acted as a family, with Lou being the father figure of the family. The Backstreet Boys and NSYNC pretty much went through the same exact development process, and they initially had a similar dynamic with Lou. He would spoil them with expensive dinners, gifts, and many parties, so the groups mirrored each other in ways that were nearly identical in a lot of areas throughout their career. However, they also had their noticeable differences. The Backstreet Boys were a bit more self-serious in their image. They weren't super flashy or overly colorful. Their look was more toned down. NSYNC was more colorful, super youth-centric, in a way that was more playful than the Backstreet Boys. NSYNC were the boys next door, and I think their album covers actually do a great job of highlighting the different fashion senses and stylistic choices they took when it came to imagery. NSYNC is way more out there and playful with their image, Backstreet Boys is a bit more tamed and stoic. Initially, NSYNC was a completely secret project, in the most extreme way possible. The secrecy had a lot to do with Lou not wanting to upset the Backstreet Boys, and then finding out that he had essentially put together a group to compete with them, especially considering Backstreet Boys were just getting started at attaining new levels of success. The label employees didn't even know about the formation of NSYNC, and they were given a code name on files. It led them to feel left out. NSYNC's rise in America was a bit slower. There was some uncertainty about the group and if they would be able to effectively break through in a major way. But the opportunity came knocking on their door when the Backstreet Boys turned down a Disney Channel performance after a grueling work schedule. They wanted a break. It was the perfect opportunity for NSYNC to swoop in and widen their fan base, and so they did. The special ran on Disney went into consistent rotation, which served as a leverage for NSYNC becoming overnight sensations. Their debut self-titled album would eventually go on to sell over 14 million copies, on the back of hits like I Want You Back and Tearing Up My Heart. They had their American breakthrough in 1998. Needless to say, the Backstreet Boys were not happy once they found out about NSYNC, and they were pretty much instantaneously rival groups in the media. The Backstreet Boys felt betrayed, and both groups had tension personally as well. At times, they couldn't even be in the same room with each other. When we started out, we were like, yeah, we're a team. We're going to take over the world, said Kevin of Backstreet. There's nobody like us. Then you find out, well, actually there is somebody like you. Lou's mentality behind the two groups was pretty much that where there's Coke, there's Pepsi. A label would eventually come out with a knockoff of the Backstreet Boys, so he wanted to do it himself, which to his credit was very smart. NSYNC was less bitter towards Backstreet Boys in the media, and even would perform their songs at shows. Lou Pearlman, on the other hand, was pretty much their common enemy. He would instigate tension and keep them on their toes and at odds with each other. He would go to Backstreet Boys and talk about NSYNC, and go to NSYNC and talk about Backstreet Boys. He seemed to realize early on the amount of money he could make from the rival. Nick Carter says, it was fabricated, but it was something that became real at a certain time. I mean, when you're that young and competitive as a teenager, it was, I like to say, healthy competition, but it started from the managers and all of that. Following their initial success, both boy bands would end up entangled in lawsuits with Lou Pearlman, claiming misrepresentation and fraud over their lack of earnings. They were making tens of millions of dollars for their label and receiving relatively nothing, even struggling at times to pay for essential things. They soon found out that the luxuries they were being treated to from someone they thought was a father figure was actually coming out of their own pocket. Lou Pearlman had written himself in as the sixth member of each group in contracts, so everything they made, he made with the inclusion of management and producer payments. This narrative is eerily similar to another group of the 90s, TLC, who infamously found themselves in less than desirable contracts. The Backstreet Boys were the first to file a lawsuit. It's important to mention for both groups that they looked up to Lou Pearlman as a father figure and someone they could trust, so it wasn't easy for them emotionally, but they were working tirelessly and not getting paid. Eventually, settlements were reached and Backstreet Boys were set free. Similarly, after finding out they weren't in a good deal, NSYNC went to court, reached a settlement, and were set free. Even though there was some resistance from Lou Pearlman with giving up the name NSYNC, the group retained it. These are the type of lawsuits that usually hinder and effectively destroy burgeoning careers, so it's quite impressive that both the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC were able to fight the lawsuits and push their careers to even newer heights. Overcoming the lawsuits didn't stop the tension between them or the comparisons, but the rivalry was beneficial to both of their careers and effectively helped create pandemonium around both groups. Both groups would go on to have truly groundbreaking success and soaring heights, which really showcases the power of marketing within teen pop. The Backstreet Boys led with their 1999 album Millennium, propelled by hits such as I Want It That Way and Larger Than Life. The album broke numerous records. It sold 1.1 million copies in its first week of release, in the USA alone. Around 500,000 copies in its first day of availability. The album would sell nearly 10 million copies in its first year, and eventually sold over 24 million copies worldwide. But during the time that the album was at its apex, No Strings Attached by NSYNC, released in 2000, would overtake Millennium. In fact, many fans purposefully bought multiple copies to break the Backstreet Boys records, and it paid off. No Strings Attached, fittingly titled after their freedom from their messy legal battle, debuted with over 2.4 million copies sold within its first week, spawning hit singles like Bye 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 and It's Gonna Be Me. It was the album that was essential to giving NSYNC more of their own identity and sold over 14 million copies worldwide. Both groups would go on to have continued success with their follow-up releases, eventually straying farther away from teen pop, and then they went into their inevitable hiatus. Justin Timberlake would obviously become a superstar in his own right. The Backstreet Boys remained the best-selling boy band of all time. Lou Pearlman, on the other hand, would continue to make other groups such as O-Town, LFAO, Take 5, and NSYNC, which Britney Spears considered joining before her solo career. The acts he would sign after the two big boy groups were very well aware of his shady business ways in the media, but a lot of them felt like this could be their only opportunity to make it, so they signed the contracts anyway. Nearly every single act he signed sued him for ripping them off. He was also accused of acting inappropriate with some of his clients, reportedly giving some of them muscle massages and telling them to take off their shirts as he would sit and watch them rehearse. Many people have been outspoken about their uncomfortable moments with him. Lou Pearlman would eventually be jailed for running a massive Ponzi scheme, one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in history, and he would use the success of Backstreet Boys and NSYNC to lure people in. He was sentenced to 25 years and died in 2016. Specifically speaking about the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, they kind of encapsulate the perfect boy band story, so much so that it's practically a trope at this point. The way they were marketed, although largely fabricated and contrived by outside forces, was extremely effective and beneficial to pushing both groups to international superstar status. They are some of the best-selling acts and groups of all time, and represent the tail end of the physical sales era, and just how much competitive marketing and anticipation could pay off with younger acts. The Backstreet Boys and NSYNC are brother groups that defined the 90s teen pop era.